Hi folks, we're just giving a few moments here at the top for Zoom to let everybody in before we get started. If you are already in tonight's webinar with us, you can open up your chat window and find some information about how to purchase books by tonight's featured authors. Good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Chelsea from Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Jocelyn C Zuckerman, presenting her new book, Planet Palm: How Palm Oil Ended Up in Everything and Endangered the World. She'll be talking with Ruth Reichl, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Jocelyn, Ruth, and the team at New Press for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Now, just a few housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they cannot see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and there are a couple of different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. That's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Planet Palm, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our bookstore locations, noon to 7 p.m. every day of the week, and you can purchase Jocelyn's book and many others on site. Or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll drop that buy link in the chat. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer for tonight is Ruth Reichl. She began writing about food in 1972 when she published A Feastiary. She has served as restaurant critic at many publications, including the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times. In 1999, she moved to Gourmet Magazine, where she was editor-in-chief for 10 years. She's authored 5 memoirs: Tender at the Bone, Comfort Me with Apples, Garlic and Sapphires, For You, Mom, Finally, and Save Me the Plums, which was published in 2019. Her novel, Delicious, was published in 2014, and her cookbook, My Kitchen Year, in 2015. She edited Best American Food Writing 2018 and the Modern Library Food Series, which currently includes 10 books. She was executive producer and host of the public television series, Adventures with Ruth, and a judge on Top Chef Masters. She is the recipient of 6 James Beard Awards. At the moment, she is working on a novel. Her most recent project is a documentary with Laura Gabbard, director of City of Gold, about the many ways the current pandemic is altering the food landscape. She'll be speaking with our featured author, Jocelyn C Zuckerman. She is the former deputy editor of Gourmet, articles editor of On Earth, and executive editor of Modern Farmer, an alumna of Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, and a former fellow with the Washington, D.C.-based Alicia Patterson Foundation. She has written for Fast Company, The American Prospect, Vogue, and many other publications. She lives in Brooklyn with her husband and 2 children. Her new book, Planet Palm, is a groundbreaking global investigation into the industry ravaging the environment and global health. Jocelyn is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then she'll be talking with Ruth and with all of you. Jocelyn, please take it away.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, and thanks for coming. So I'm going to just start at the beginning of the book and read a little bit of the introduction, and then I'm going to skip and read just a little bit from chapter 8. This is the prologue. It's called Oil Crisis. Kurt Cobain was shrieking in my ears. I was rattling over a dirt road in a remote corner of southeastern Liberia, staring out the window of a Land Cruiser at a landscape rendered entirely in burnt orange. Just a few weeks earlier, the place had been dense forest, raucous with the chirps and squawks of birds, the scratching of animals in the underbrush. Clear streams had trickled over rocks. For generations, the families in this pocket of the West African nation founded by freed American slaves had collected rattan from the forest for building their homes and furniture. The men had returned in the evenings bearing honey crabs and groundhogs. Women, their infants tethered to their backs, had bent over plots of yams, melons, and beans in clearings by their huts. All that remained of such time-honored tableaus now were the thousands of dead trees laid at intervals along the endless expanse of dirt. In the early morning fog, they evoked fallen soldiers on a still smoking battlefield. We drove on for miles, past a view comprising only scarred dirt and dead vegetation, punctuated by the occasional bright yellow cat excavator. The destruction, in both its scope and its finality, was like nothing I'd ever seen. And so had come the pounding drums and sneering guitars of Nirvana's Rape Me, the grim earworm that would become the soundtrack to my trip. The more I saw, the louder the internal rage. I'd driven down to Sino County from the Liberian capital, Monrovia, accompanied by an Italian photographer and a couple of local researchers, to report a story about land grabs, or large-scale territorial acquisitions by outsiders. The phenomenon, which had come to the world's attention in the aftermath of the financial and food crisis of 2008, entails investment banks, pension funds, land-poor countries, and agribusiness, seizing vast swaths of fertile ground in places like Ethiopia and Madagascar, places where traditional land rights are easy to exploit. I'd chosen to focus on Liberia in part because I'd long admired its president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, but also because of its historical ties to the United States. It wasn't until I got down on the ground that I discovered that the grabbing had almost entirely to do with palm oil. And despite having spent 12 years on the staff of Gourmet and written dozens of articles about the environment and agriculture, I knew next to nothing when it came to this substance. Liberia proved a rude awakening. The violence on display there extended beyond the destruction of the landscape to the Liberians themselves. In one village, a scattering of mud block and thatch houses located inside an oil pump concession run by a Singapore-based company, a 50-year-old father of 7 described how the outsiders had shown up and bulldozed the town in which he'd spent his entire life. Others talked of how the company had destroyed their crops and grave sites, polluted their streams, and run them out of their homes. What I've lost is plenty, a 53-year-old woman told me through tears. We can't plant plantains, we can't plant rice, we can't plant peppers. The people who had ripped out her crops to replace them with oil palm had given the woman a one-time payment of a few $100s. It's finished a long time ago, she told me. A Monrovia-based lawyer advocating for the locals lamented the community members' loss of identity. The guy who was a respected farmer, he said, has now become a slave laborer. The company responsible for the changes had been in operation in Sino for just 13 months. It had signed an 865,000-acre lease, good for 65 years, with an option for a 33-year extension. In other words, it was just getting started. And now I will skip to, this is chapter 5, it's called Silent Summers, and it's a look at the impact of the palm oil industry on biodiversity. And I reported this from Sumatra. And it introduces a character named Ian Singleton, who's a British primatologist, but he's been living in Sumatra for, I think, 25 years. And in the first sentence, I referred to somebody named Putra. This is Rudy Putra, who's another local person who lives in Indonesia. I think we're going to talk about him later, just when you hear the name. Hard drinking, hard smoking, and his foul mouth as Putra is polite, Ian Singleton finishes most of his long days holding rowdy court on the back patio of Roland's, a funky German joint that serves as watering hole to the motley crew of expats who call Medan their home. The capital of North Sumatra province, just southeast of Aceh, the city is a rough and tumble sort of place, as well known for its drugs and wildlife trafficking as it is for being a center of the palm oil trade. As our plane descended over it, the pilot had informed the passengers on my cheap regional flight that the possession of illegal narcotics would be subject to penalty by death. Having grown up in northern England, Singleton worked as a zookeeper before relocating to Sumatra 25 years ago to pursue field work for his PhD in anthropology. He married an Indonesian woman and has lived here ever since. Today, the father of two heads up the Sumatran Orangutan Conservation Program, or SOCP, which he co-founded in 2001. He'd agreed to my request for a meeting somewhat grudgingly. Between managing a staff of 120 and juggling the endless administrative tasks involved in trying to save a species on the brink of extinction, Singleton doesn't have a whole lot of time for strangers. He also, having spent 2 years living in the swamps on the western coast of Sumatra, surrounded only by wild orangutans, gives the impression of a man for whom my type of hominoid is perhaps not his favorite type. Still, he welcomed me into SOCP headquarters, a residential building in its quietest section of the city, where the utilitarian decor echoed Singleton's own can't be bothered aesthetic. The boyish 55-year-old tends toward cargo shorts and rubber clogs, or for the office, dark jeans and baggy soccer shirts. Grabbing a can of instant Nescafe and a jar of non-dairy creamer from his nail cubby, he led me up a flight of stairs to his office, a tsunami of notebooks, papers, and reports, with orangutan photos in cheap frames nailed randomly to the walls. He opened his MacBook Air and began walking me through the PowerPoint presentation that he uses in the fundraising efforts he wishes he didn't have to make. Beginning with a quick history of the palm oil industry, he explained how the region's orangutans were being forced from their jungle homes by the ever-multiplying plantations. The primates might try to move to a nearby forest, he said, only to find it already full of other orangutans. With only so much food to go around, many end up dying of starvation. A mother and her infant might wander into a village or plantation in search of something to eat and be shot or clubbed to death. Orphaned infants often were captured and sold as pets. One of his slides showed two SOCP staffers armed with tranquilizer guns and a net, rescuing a marooned and starving animal from the top of a tree surrounded by an endless sea of oil palm. Such refugees get transported to viable patches of forest elsewhere on the island, or if they've been wounded or orphaned, taken to SOCP's rehabilitation center, known as the Quarantine, located an hour's drive outside of Medan. Singleton clicked to a slide featuring what looked remarkably like a small child, with tiny fingers grasping the bars of a cage. Orangutans, which are considered the most intelligent of all primates, share roughly 97% of humans' DNA. People go, "Oh, the poor thing," he said, "but these are the lucky ones. All the other ones are dead." His phone buzzed with incoming texts and WhatsApp messages, and the landline rang incessantly. Singleton fielded the calls and the repeated interruptions by staffers poking their heads in the door in English, Bahasa, or the local Carinese dialect, as the situation required. He clicked to an aerial shot of the Tripa Swamp, a waterlogged expanse on the west coast of the island, and launched into what I would come to recognize as a typical Singleton rant. Tripa is classic of Indonesia, he began. You've got a peat swamp area. It's primary forest, loads of biodiversity. It's full of fish and it's full of water. And you've got a few local communities that traditionally catch those fish, and it provides most of their protein. All the water supply for the local community is from the water table. And then you've got some people who actually consider they own bits of the land because it was cleared by their great-grandparents, but they don't have any paperwork. So you get a company then from Jakarta or somewhere who comes in and just evicts everybody. Fuck off. Hey, that's my land. Paperwork? Sorry, mate. So they're kicked off. And then the company offers such shitty wages that none of these people want to work for it. They don't like the company anyway. They've just been evicted. So then they get labor cheaper from offshore islands, and they come and live in shitty conditions. Then the company chops all the forests down. So you annihilate everything that lives there, including ants and termites and funguses, incinerate the whole fucking thing. Then you dig canals, because in order to grow oil palm, you need at least a meter of dry peat to plant the thing. And then the river levels go down, the fisheries disappear, and you've got all these people who used to make their living and water supplies and protein source. All of a sudden they've got fuck all. And they're surrounded by plantations. So even if they did have any money, they can't grow any vegetables or fruits because there's one village in Tripa where they asked for a hectare to build a graveyard and they were refused. So they've got nothing. They're totally screwed. Their water supply is gone, their livelihood's gone, their protein is gone. They don't even want to work there. They've got nothing. And then some company or some guy in Jakarta who's probably never even been there, his bank account is going up and up and up and up and up for 25 or 30 years.
Wow. I have to say, I kind of fell in love with Ian Singleton reading your book. But one of the things that I think is so extraordinary about your book is that it's filled with fabulous characters. And, you sort of start with history. So you don't start today. You actually give us a history of palm oil, which we see through these incredible people. And you begin this by sort of making a connection between slavery and palm oil. And you begin with what for me was a really startling statistic that between 1750 and 1780, 70% of the English government's income came from taxes on slave-powered colonies. And I don't want to go through all of these historical characters because I mean one is more colorful than the next. But I think I'd like to ask you to tell us a little bit about Lever, because he's someone who is still in our lives today. I mean, Unilever is one of the great multinational companies, and in many ways, he embodies everything that is awful about colonialism and exploitation and what the West has done to other parts of the world. Can you talk a little bit about him?
Sure. So he was a shopkeeper's son growing up in Bolton, which was an industrial town in England. His dad had like a grocery store, and he took it over and sort of very ambitious little guy, very little guy. And he started, he realized that the demand for margarine was going up. So he sort of focused on that. And then he lived near Liverpool. So he saw the imports of palm oil and palm kernel oil coming in from West Africa. It was being used for making soap. And so then he decided that he was going to get in on that. So he was working with his brother at the time. Eventually his brother got sick and died. So it was just Lever on his own. But he sort of just exploded the industry or expanded to different countries. But he decided that he wanted his own supply of palm oil and palm kernels, in part because he didn't sort of trust the African workers. He thought he could make them work harder, and also just because he didn't want any middlemen. So he asked around a couple of the West African colonies, and people refused him. In part, Nigeria did, because they just got rid of this other guy, George Goldie, about whom I write in the first chapter. He basically went in and took over the whole palm oil trade, which the Nigerians had been running on their own, and created this monopoly and destroyed their markets. And anyway, so then Lever ended up in the Belgian Congo on the heels of King Leopold, about whom viewers probably know. And the thing is, Lever, he thought he was like a great guy. He thought he was very interested in sort of building humanity and Christianity and hard work. And so he went in there, and so after Leopold, the Belgian government took over the Congo, and they gave him five big concessions. I forget how many square acres each were, but I've got a map in here, and you can see that it's a big chunk of the country. So anyway, he went in there and was sourcing palm oil and palm kernels. Here you go. Those are the land that he took over. And basically he told the government, I'm going to do this, this is going to benefit the Congolese as much as it benefits me. We're going to bring in these Jesuit priests, we're going to educate them. And then just like Leopold had done, basically used forced labor they were in horrible living conditions, and they used this thing called the shikut, which is a hippopotamus hide, to whip them. And he basically had to bring people into these areas where the oil palm groves were. So he was going to establish plantations, but they were already natural groves. But to harvest the plant, they needed a lot more people than were living there. So they basically forced these people to migrate and paid off chiefs to give them more and more labor and use child labor. And then he went back to England and said, oh, you should see what I'm doing there. I've built beautiful houses, and it's great for everyone involved.
Yeah, and then it gets repeated. I mean, you see over and over again these like really interesting characters come in and they just do horrible things. And so that's sort of all in the past. But I think the most remarkable thing about your book is your reporting is really breathtaking. I mean, you went to the scariest places in the world, out in the middle of nowhere, where people who snoop around are getting murdered all the time. And you know, some of these places, I mean, you read us a little bit about Ian Singleton, who, you know, it's just such a wonderful character, but you describe your time in Sumatra in is it pronounced the Lucer ecosystem, a 5.6 million acre expanse of lowland and rainforest that is the last place on the planet where there's enough land to support viable populations of Sumatran tigers, elephants and rhinos, orangutans, leopards and sun bears. It sounds like the most amazing place on earth. Is it?
It was amazing. And the birds, you know, I was with the bird watchers because I was looking for these hornbills, which were being poached for their casts. And so just the sounds and I mean, it was like a fairy tale world being deep in that forest. It was like, I mean, I've been in other primary forests before, I think, but I'd never been in any place that was so remote and just pulsing with life. As I said, we had leeches all over us, and they're just like the sounds and, you know, trees just with these massive trunks, but all vines twisting all around them. And you could like barely see the sky. It's that dense.
And so you spent time with Ian, and you also spent time with this guy, Rudy Putra, who has devoted his life to protecting the region's wildlife. And the reason that he has to do this is because these people who have nothing, the one thing that they can do is get these casks from these birds, which are now more valuable than ivory. Mm. And you know, it's kind of heartbreaking. I mean, they don't like killing these animals.
Saying that last sentence, that so I spent some time in this house with these poachers who've been shooting down these helmeted hornbills, which are these amazing birds, but now endangered. And one of them said that the gun normally that they get was, I think, 4.5 millimeter, but he had it outfitted with especially for a 5.5 millimeter bullet because the other smaller ones don't kill the birds on contact, and they couldn't stand to see them suffer. So yeah, it's like these sweet people just screw, you know, their backs against the wall, just trying to survive.
Oh, and then you go with a group called Eyes on the Forest, who sound like they're in Honduras. Is that right?
That was also Sumatra.
Oh, it's also Sumatra.
I spent a lot of time in Indonesia.
So talk about what it was like being with these Eyes on the Forest people, because that sounded really frightening.
Well, first of all, it was 5 guys or 6 guys and me. None of them spoke English, and I don't speak Bahasa. So and we were together for like 5 days. So it was sort of an adventure. I did have an interpreter who was from their organization, but you hear some of the quotes. I had a line in there about he was called an interpreter, but it was sort of, so communication was interesting. But they were actually like total mensches. I mean, these guys they're very professional. As I said, in the mornings they'd be sort of hunkered over their computers, looking at, you know, GPS stuff and tracking like import data to see, you know, where the palm oil was being produced and where it was, to what ports it was going to, what refineries it was going to, and then what ports, so that they could track it from illegal, usually national parks or other sort of peatlands where they're not supposed to be planting or harvesting oil palm. So what they do is they trace it all undercover, and then they trace it to the mills and then to the refinery, and then they use export data to say this is actually going to Kellogg's and it's going to Nestle and it's going to PepsiCo, so that they can try to put some pressure on these companies to then come back and make them change their ways. So we were basically, we were in the car a lot because we were tracking trucks and where they were getting the oil pump from, and then to the mill. And as I said, the one guy, the sort of the dad in chief, as I said, he was just this sort of nerdy guy, but he would get out of the car and just start, like, we passed one guy who had a big truck of oil palm fruits that it was clear that it was from this illegal plantation. And this guy gets out, I can't use his real name, but he just starts chatting him up. He was like, oh, nice day, is this where we see the tigers? It looks like you got a good harvest. Where are you taking it? And the guy said to so-and-so, and he said, oh, my uncle lives there. Like, he just was bullshitting his way, getting all this information. The other guy's taking pictures of the license plate. And anyway, so they were very clever. They knew exactly what they were doing. It didn't feel that scary. It was really the scariest that I felt in my reporting was Guatemala and Honduras, because it's all bound up in the drug trade. And that was kind of terrifying. I don't know where my paranoia ended and the real threat began, but I felt nervous a lot. These guys were so, they're so professional. They've been doing this for so long that I sort of felt like they wouldn't get us into trouble.
Well, the Honduras stuff, Sam, I mean, what you write about in Honduras is, palm oil has made people's lives absolutely miserable. There are pesticides, which they have no, they're just all getting sick from the pesticides. There's involuntary servitude, child labor. There's strikers killed by the government. There's union busting. There's snakes, which their fangs go through these skinny rubber boots. And then there's the thing that really drove me crazy in that was that, all of these people had good food at one. The forest provided, no matter where palm oil is being grown now, where these, the forests are being cut down for these palm trees, the forest has given these people everything. And it's all been taken away. So
in different countries, people said to me that the forest is our grocery store. They get their medicine, they get their building materials, they get their protein, they get their clean water, everything.
But all of it, one guy in Sumatra said to you, my children are like refugees compared to when I was young and could walk in the woods anytime. Rambutan, jackfruit, durian, we used to get all of them. We used to fish the river. We'd get wood for our houses. Now we have to buy it. The river's polluted. We have to buy water. And then in Guatemala, one person told you that only one species of fish has managed to survive in the polluted water because there's so much runoff from the plantations. And this fish sounds like the most diabolical fish. They call it el avión.
And then it's devilfish, right?
Yeah. And they said they grow to as long as a foot. They bite at the women's feet when they go to do the wash, and their fins leave bloody cuts on the ankles. One guy said, these are the only fish we can catch, these devilfish. You can't eat them. They're all bones. And that just gives me the creeps. So you then go from,
sorry, you go.
You then go from writing about what is happening on the palm oil plantations and what it's doing to the environment, to what palm oil is doing to not just the diets of the people who are being displaced by the palm oil plantations, but what it's doing to everybody who eats it. And there's nothing uplifting about so much of this. You write, it's common to blame sugar for the world's weight problems, but in the last half century, refined vegetable oils have added far more calories to the global diet than any other food group. Between 1961 and 2009, the availability of palm oil worldwide went up 206%. Over the same period, the availability of sugar and sweeteners increased by just 20%. And then I think the most shocking thing, and there's a lot of shocking stuff here when you get into what palm oil is doing to us, is you went and you visited someone in India. And I think it really resonates particularly for us at this moment because of what's going on in India. And, you know, COVID is very much a food disease. You know, I mean, one of the reasons it has hit some populations so hard is because they're so malnourished. You know, I mean, if this had happened in 1970, it probably would have been a bad flu season. But because all of us in the world are not very well nourished, it's really hit us hard. But it's hitting really hard in India. And tell us about this particular kind of solid palm oil that they're selling in India.
So just to very quickly tell people the oil palm fruit, it's about like this big, like the size of a date, or like sort of a flattened plum, and it's kind of shiny orange. It's got this like meat, shiny orangish red meat, and then inside is a white kernel. So you get palm oil from the meat, and then palm kernel oil from the white kernel. And so the palm kernel oil is used mostly for cosmetics and personal care products, and also like for chocolates. It's much harder. It's 80% saturated fat, as opposed to the palm oil, which is 50% saturated fat. And then they fractionate, they divide up both of these oils and then do all sorts of chemical processes on them, which is why it's so applicable to so many different things. But anyway, so the red part, they split into like a solid part and a liquid. The liquid is called palm olein and the solid is palm stearin. So yeah, I went to this oil trader. He traded soy oil, palm oil, and mustard, I think, one other. But he said that in the past decade, he was doing more than half trade. It was more and more palm oil. So he took me into his sort of storage area, and he said, you know, the palm oil is cheaper than all the other ones, which is why in India, where people have a lot of money, they're all buying palm oil, even though most of them don't admit it because there's like a stigma to it. But so he showed me like the liquid oil in the tins, and then he took me over to a box on the floor and pulled back the flap and showed me this white stuff that looked like, as I said in the book, like sort of children's modeling clay. And so that's the palm stearin, the solid part that results after fractionating. And he said, this is a bad oil. This is, I don't like to sell this one. I only D-grade people buy this oil. If you take a teaspoon every day, you're going to die, but we sell it. Sorry.
If you take one spoonful every day for a month, you're going to die.
I mean, he was maybe a little hyperbolic, but he knew it wasn't like a great thing for people to be putting in their bodies. And he said, but I sell it because money. Right?
And you know, we in the West we don't really understand how much we are putting into other countries. So you say on the PepsiCo website, you can learn that the 28-gram bags of Cheetos in the United States have 1.5 grams of saturated fat. The Cheetos in India have a saturated fat content of 5.3 grams. I mean, that's just, you know, let's just dump this stuff.
And they had changed. Some years earlier in Mexico, there was an internal memo that I saw that said, you know, we need to do better on the health front. And one of the most important things we can do is change from these highly saturated tropical oils to better oils. So no, it was in India. They changed, I forget what year, from using palm oil to using rice bran oil. And there was a big campaign. They had it on the packages. Forget what it was called, the Health Plus or something. And then in this internal memo, they said like, you know, commodity prices made it so that was too expensive. We had to go back. This is PepsiCo, you know, they've got some money. They had to go back to palm oil because the commodities were too expensive. So they know exactly what they're doing, but they can get away with it too, because And same with all the fast food companies that are going in there. They don't have, you know, there are no labeling requirements. I emailed one, forget which one, and she said, oh, you can, you know, ask like the server at the place or use the contact us information on the website, like to get the calories and saturated fat value. I'm sure you get a response right away if you send that from Ghana.
Oh, yep, absolutely, absolutely. And so you sort of end the book talking about environmental risks. And I didn't even know about Indonesia's peat swamps.
Neither did I before I started this. I didn't know from peat at all.
So like, tell us, I mean, because one of the things Ian Singleton says, you destroy all of Indonesia's peat swamps, planet Earth becomes uninhabitable. Don't they care? I mean, they're just.
Yeah, I mean, that's what, you know, Bill McKibben was saying the other day. I guess he wrote it in the New York that, you know, in terms of Exxon, in terms of all these energy companies, that people always say to him, don't they have grandchildren? You know, which is, you have to wonder. But I mean, part of it is, as we know, there's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of money at the top of the palm oil industry in Indonesia. A lot of the folks in charge are still like Suharto cronies. So it's an old boys club. And then, you know, the poachers and other people are trying to feed their families. So they set the stuff on fire. So anyway, peat is basically organic matter that's like formed over thousands of years. It's waterlogged. So it's just like a carbon bomb. And in Sumatra and Borneo as well, it can be like 60 feet deep. And so the oil palm companies, when they come in, they dig trenches in this peat to bring the equipment in barges, knock down all the rainforests, and then set it on fire. So you set this on fire, and it's just like it's a carbon bomb. That's why Ian said, like, this is I think I have draining a single hectare, 2.5 acres of tropical peat emits an average of 55,000 tons of carbon dioxide every year, roughly the same as burning more than 6,000 gallons of gasoline. The Nairobi-based World Agroforestry Center has found that the peatland-based biodiesels may in fact produce nearly 4 times the emissions of petroleum diesel. So this was the whole thing with biofuels. People thought, oh, we're gonna use, you know, plants to basically the US and the EU put in these biofuels mandates in the mid 2000s. But then it was mostly soy oil here that was being diverted to biofuels. So the soy oil that was no longer available for the food supply was palm oil coming in. But in coming up with this idea for energy independence, they didn't factor in that in order to, you know, keep the food supply as it is, we're going to need to get oil from somewhere else, and that's going to involve chopping down rainforests and draining peat swamps. And so that's why that comparison between sort of biodiesel and petroleum-based fuel. So the whole idea was like backward. It's way more carbon emissions than it would have been having this peat forest standing.
What I don't understand is why don't any of us know about peat? I mean, it sounds like, I mean, it sounds really serious, right? I mean, we are destroying.
Yeah, as he says, I mean, if we fuck that up, if we screwed up that like 1.5%, 1.5 degree centigrade, it's blown. You know, our budget, there's too much carbon in that stuff. And there's a massive, like 3 years ago, they discovered a massive peat swamp, biggest one in the world, I think, in Central Africa. It goes over the DRC and the Republic of Congo. And as I say in the book, it's right at that latitude where it's great to grow oil palm. So yeah, we need to pay those countries, the global community needs to pay those countries to keep that shit in the ground.
I was stunned because it's literally, I mean, I do follow this stuff and it's not something I've heard about before. And it seems like something is really serious that we need to be paying attention to. Okay, so I want to, you go on to deal with, a lot more issues here, but is there any good news?
In the book, I mentioned in the end this company Xylome, which is based in Wisconsin, and they're trying to make synthetic palm oil. There's another one called C16 Biosciences that got a lot of funding from Bill Gates. I forget what the organization is called. And there was actually news, I think last week, one of our friends emailed me that they just rented out a huge facility in Manhattan actually to be, so apparently they're progressing in the science to be making this synthetic palm oil. And there are a couple other things. So during the Biden's climate summit, there was an announcement of this organization called LEAF, Lowering Emissions by Accelerating Forest Finance. So, and it was the US, Britain, and Norway, along with a bunch of big companies like Amazon, Airbnb, Unilever, and Nestle. So I think there's finally an understanding like this. We need to keep these forest standings. It's in our interest. It's not something that's happening on the other side of the planet. We need to, do that, and we need to pay money to these. We can't be over here saying, "Oh, you people are so terrible. You're cutting down your rainforest." We need to pay them to keep them standing.
Do you think that the fact that we know that all these diseases are now coming from animals we are pushing out of their natural habitats, so we're having contact with wild animals, bats, for instance, who are giving us things like COVID, SARS. I mean, all these diseases that are coming up now are I think they're called zoonotic.
Mm-hmm.
And I would hope that the COVID crisis would make us and make these companies aware of the fact that what they're doing is really dangerous, that you can't just push these animals out of their habitat.
Right. A third of new zoonotic diseases can be linked directly to deforestation and agricultural intensification, most of it involving tropical rainforests. So yeah, I think maybe people are starting to understand this. Like, we've all read a lot about pandemics and how this happens. So maybe that could be good in the long run, that we understand how important it is to keep forests standing.
So I keep hoping someone will ask a question, but
there are no questions.
Oh, here's a question.
There's stuff in the chat, but I didn't look at what it is.
It's widely known that palm oil is one of the main ingredients of most cosmetics, vegetable oils, processed foods. What are some products that people wouldn't think contain palm oil?
I guess cosmetics, so that's like toothpaste, mascara, lipstick, instant noodles. I think it's like 20% of instant noodles.
I know, I can't eat ramen anymore after reading your book. It drives me crazy.
Ice cream, candy bars, Nutella, everybody knows. I mean, any sort of baked good that you're going to get. Infant formula, people probably don't know that. There's a part of palm oil in infant formula, a fraction.
That's really scary.
Mm.
Are there things that you stop?
Also, animal food. And they use the meal from the kernel to feed livestock, and then it's the same that's in like dog food and cat food.
Of course it is. Are there things that you've stopped eating because of the work that you've been doing?
Somebody asked me this question the other day, and I thought I gave the worst answer, but it's kind of the true answer, which is that I don't eat a ton of processed food anyway. And I did these 22 radio interviews yesterday, and a lot of the interviewers asked me, what can we do? And that's the main thing. If you're not eating processed food, you're not going to encounter it. It's about 7% in cosmetics and personal care products. So, I think it's harder to avoid there, if you're not eating a shit diet, basically.
Yeah, I watched an interview with Michael Moss, who just wrote this book, Hooked.
Right.
And he did this amazing thing where he took a package of Fritos and he crunched it up like that, and he set fire to it. And it just burned like a torch. I mean, it turns out that they're 50% fat.
Yeah, wow.
So Ingrid would like to know, what can an individual person do to reduce the demand for palm oil?
I think probably get involved in like campaigns, right? And write to legislators. So Brian Schatz announced a couple of weeks ago that he is going to introduce legislation that would put in place import requirements for agricultural commodities associated with illegal deforestation. So you could, write to Congress people and say that you back that sort of thing. Otherwise, I would say look on the websites of like the Rainforest Action Network, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth. They're mostly sort of on the deforestation side of things, and then Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International are looking at the labor issues, and they've got lots of research there, and you could like get involved in campaigns and get it on social media. I think making companies, making the consumer-facing companies, the traders, and the producers aware that people care about it. They want to know sort of where it's coming from. Can you show us some transparency? Do you have on your website exactly where it's coming from? Show it, what's the proof that you're not using slave labor, that there aren't human rights abuses involved in your supply chain?
Yeah, I think there is nothing like consumer. I mean, they do listen, right? I mean, people said they didn't want to eat eggs from tortured chickens, and McDonald's said we won't use them anymore.
But the thing with palm oil is none of us knew, right? And also, so much of it is like so far away that it was there. It's easy to hide all the nefarious stuff that's going on with it, particularly the labor issues. But yeah, I think if that was the reason for writing the book, like people should know, and then I think if there's an outcry, then maybe we could make a difference.
Are there any federal, state, or local laws in the U.S. or other countries regulating palm oil production?
I just wrote a piece for Yale E360 today, the lead of which was that about 3 weeks ago, the Sri Lankan president outlawed, he not only outlawed imports, he said everybody needs to rip up their oil palm plants.
Really?
In the country. Yeah, he said, sorry, there was a quote. He said, citing concerns about soil erosion, water scarcity, and threats to biodiversity and public health, he explained that his aim was to make the country free from oil palm plantations and palm oil consumption. The entire country. So that's pretty radical. And as I said, Brian Schatz is about to introduce this legislation, and there's other legislation that was recently introduced in the EU that is very much sort of clamping down on commodities coming in that are linked to illegal deforestation. And there's like human rights components to that as well.
And I mean, ultimately, I think in this country, it's not laws that are going to change it. I think that if people think it's bad for them, I think for Americans, the thing that really makes a change is when, people think, well, this is really bad for me and I won't eat it anymore. And it is bad for you. I mean,
yeah, I just wonder, like, what's the overlap of the people who are sort of, as I said, it's ultra processed foods that it's in mainly. So I don't know if that's the population that is that concerned about what they're putting in their bodies.
Well, I mean, the truth is that we all eat processed food from time to time, and
time to time, yeah. But I mean, I would hope that given the pandemic, given climate change emergency, people would see that this is like in everybody's interest to get this in order and to stop cutting down tropical rainforests, because time is running out.
Right. Jocelyn, so this is from Marissa.
Hi, Marissa.
What an ambitious topic you've tackled here. How on earth did you do it? How did you stay organized and focused? What was your timeline from when you first became interested in palm oil to today?
It was longer than I intended it to be. So the Liberia trip, I think, was in 2014. And I didn't come back and determine right away that I should write a book. But it took me a long time, partly because it costs a lot of money to travel to all these places. So I got like magazine assignments so that I could get people to pay me to take these trips. I did get a fellowship from the Alicia Patterson Foundation, which was amazing. That was $40,000. So that like underwrote a lot of my travel. But these trips took a long time too. I mean, Indonesia is on the other side of the world. Like I didn't need to change my watch. If it was 3 p.m. here, it was 3 a.m. there. So you know, it takes a day and a half to get there. You're really jet lagged. And then to get to a lot of these plantations was like 8 hours, you know, in a 4-wheel drive. That's part of my excuse. Also, as Ruth said, like I did take on a lot. You know, I wanted to go back. I didn't know what I was doing, frankly, but then I decided I wanted to go back. I started reading about the history and I found it so fascinating. But, you know, it's hard to write about any of these things without feeling like you've really got your arms around it. You don't want to miss the big picture. So I spent a lot more time like doing research on each of these chapters and, you know, reading some Indonesian history and stuff than I knew I would be doing when I went into it. I had a huge outline on my wall where I sort of moved things around. And I was going to show, I bought like all these obscure books about my daughter would make fun of me because I have the most like trade and politics in the Niger Delta. Very, very specific books. They're commerce and economic change in West Africa. And then I have like 50 of these with like tiny print, you know, from all my reporting trips. So yeah, this is my excuse for why it took me several years to do this. But I just found my way as I went. And, you know, I didn't know how to organize it. The whole time I was thinking like I need my Cesar Chavez or I need my one character through whom I can follow this whole thing. And I never found that. And that's why I have these different characters for each chapter. But I just figured it out as I went. And
I have to say, you know, I mean, it drove me crazy that it was taking you so long, because when you first started doing it, I thought, God, nobody knows anything about palm oil. What a great topic. And then stuff started coming out about palm oil. And I thought, you know,
there are books coming out like in the next year. They're mostly academic, but there's one, Oil Palm: A Global History, coming out next month.
Good thing you.
Yeah,
but you know, the thing is that, you know, I was just dead wrong, because there may be stuff coming out that I don't know what they're like, but this is amazing. I mean, I knew a little bit about palm oil, but you've really done something remarkable here. I mean, this is, it's a picture of, you know, the greed and venality of human people. And you could probably do it for, you know, other commodities as well. But you get a picture of palm oil, and you know, after reading this book, and God knows I had, you know, knew about palm oil over the past few years, but I won't touch anything with palm oil in it anymore. I mean, it's just, you know, I mean, I went through and threw out all the ramen yeah. I mean,
what about like toothpaste and shampoo and stuff? That's too hard.
I hadn't thought about toothpaste and shampoo.
It's like 7% of production. So
I guess we all need to find out which toothpaste. I mean, maybe Tom's of Maine doesn't have it.
It has it.
It has it? Really? Is there any toothpaste without it?
I'm not sure, but I looked there when I was doing this piece for Vogue. I looked for all the ones that I thought wouldn't have it, and I believe Tom's of Maine had it. I may be wrong, but
well,
there's soap or something had it.
I think you need to do an article about, you know, the shampoo we can use, the toothpaste we can use. Because really, I mean, you read this book and you think, I just don't want to be part of a world where people are being exploited like this. I mean, there's pictures of these little kids, you know, doing this horrible work. I mean, it's heartbreaking. And
yeah, and as I said, you know, so much of it is in such remote places that they just gotta get away with a lot of stuff that I think other industries don't.
So Pam Frederick wants to know, knowing what you know, how have you changed your habits?
That's what we were just talking about. I wish I could say that I've changed them a lot more, but as I said, I feel like I don't eat that many foods with palm oil. I wrote the book. That's my contribution for that. Thanks, Pam.
Okay, well, I think it's time to go. It's been
Thank you, Ruth.
so,
Nice to see you.
thank you so much for writing this book. It's a real contribution.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn and Ruth, for this excellent conversation tonight. And thank you for everyone who joined us and shared the space for conversation connection with us. A reminder that you can buy Planet Palm from Greenlight Bookstore. I've dropped the buy link in the chat. You can order it online for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere within the US. Or if you're local to Brooklyn, Greenlight is open noon to 7 p.m. for limited capacity shopping, and you can find Jocelyn's book and Ruth's books and many other books on site. Have a great evening, everyone, and thank you all again. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Ruth. See you soon.
Yep. Bye.